Good evening to all of you. Welcome once again to this virtual discussion. Annually, we are grateful to Ravi to spare time from such hectic schedule. So, Ravi, I'm going to mute all, then I will unmute you, and then we will get going for rest of it. Okay, so my friend, I'm going to mute you all, and then I will unmute. Okay, now Ravi, you can unmute yourself and then we get going. Yeah, you are already. So, everybody knows Ravi. I think he doesn't need an introduction. Still, for the sake of people who might need some background about him, Ravi is editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. He's also the host of Foreign Policy Live, the magazine's video channel and podcast, on which he regularly interviews world leaders and policymakers. Before joining Foreign Policy in 2018, Agrawal worked at CNN for almost 10 years in full-time roles spanning 3 continents, including as the network's New Delhi bureau chief and its correspondent. He has shared a Peabody Award and 3 Emmy nominations for his work as a TV producer, and his writing foreign policy was part of a series nominated for 2020 National Magazine Award for columns and commentary. Agrawal is author of India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. He's a graduate of Harvard University. So thank you, Ravi. Now, let me start off because you have given me 60 minutes. For me, each minute is important. And I was reading our Boston based Indian journalist Seema Sirohi. She wrote a piece in India, Times of India, saying that Washington is witnessing a Category 5 political hurricane, and most Americans are loving it. Now, do you share the same feeling that everybody is loving what is happening in? I think Mr. Fabian, can you please mute your phone, Mr. Fabian? Not Ravi. Okay, Ravi, you unmute and please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So your question is whether Americans are loving this political moment. I don't know, is my answer. I saw that column. Frankly, America is deeply polarized right now. It's very easy to be in a bubble. Trump supporters are only hanging out with Trump supporters. The Democrats are only hanging out with the Democrats. So it's easy if you spend time with one side or the other. It can seem very all or nothing. I don't feel comfortable making a broader judgment that everyone is loving this moment. The reality is, there's clearly some populist appeal for what Trump is doing, which is, bringing a more transactional approach to domestic policy and foreign policy, seemingly slashing a lot of the bureaucracy. But a lot of people are also very worried about that. Slashing the FAA, the Aviation Authority, for example, does not bode well for anyone who's flying. It doesn't inspire confidence. Slashing US aid is also something that, on the one hand, people can criticize US aid all they want, but there are global implications to it that are worrisome. So anyway, I won't belabor the point, but I don't quite agree with Seema's piece.
Okay, now tell me, sheer by the number of executive orders issued and the speed which they have been issued and the impact which they are having in USA and abroad, can one say that Donald Trump today is the most powerful elected monarch of 21st century? I'm told he's fond of Bonaparte, Napoleon.
You could say so. Time will tell. Remember, there are a lot of checks and balances still in place. The courts have been trying to stymie some of his executive orders. There is still, resistance to some of the moves he's trying to push through. So, at this point, again, I would, respectfully, divert this question because He clearly wants to be a monarch. The system doesn't accommodate a monarch.
Oh,
And he also has some very powerful friends in people like Elon Musk, who, some would say, is co-president of sorts. So again, I usually steer clear of these assessments.
okay. Now, none can question Trump's goal of making America great again, but attacking established institutions and bureaucracy, dismantling decades old conventions, and overturning financial commitment and creating an atmosphere of intimidation and fear is not really the best way to achieve it. Would you agree with this kind of statement?
Yeah, to a degree, I would. I think a lot of what Trump is doing is based on short-term wins. And to me, I'm skeptical of the longer-term gains. So I'll just give you a few quick examples, not exactly what you were describing, but a few quick examples. I'm sure we'll talk about Europe. So Europe is very much on my mind right now because I just came back from the Munich Security Conference. And it really seems like America is antagonizing its closest ally, its treaty ally in NATO, in a way that has short-term upsides maybe for America, in that it is forcing NATO allies to spend more on defense. It is changing a lot of the dynamics that existed in terms of the power dynamics for the relationship. But there's a huge longer term downside, and that is that the mood in Europe, I cannot stress this enough. If there's one thing I want to leave this group with from this call, it is that European leaders, having listened to JD Vance's speech in Munich on Saturday, having heard that Trump and Putin had a conversation on the phone that did not include them at all, they are now more than ever feeling that they need to go it alone. They need to figure out their own longer term plan that does not involve relying on the United States. This brings me back to the point I was saying about Trump. It's a short-term win for him to appear tough on Europe. It's a longer-term loss for them to lose Europe. I'll remind your listeners, the only time NATO's Article 5, which is the rule that you attack one of us, you attack all of us, the only time that rule was invoked was right after 9/11, when the rest of the NATO membership came to help the United States. It really begs the question, in the future, if Article 5 were to be invoked, how committed are the other members to come to the aid of a country that is so clearly saying, my way or the highway? That is just one example of the short-term thinking, I think, of this administration's foreign policy right now, in the here and now, that worries a lot of people. I'll give you another example, tariffs, which are, again, in the short term, they may, redirect or change some of the dynamics in a trading relationship. But in the longer term, they are clearly inflationary. They also force countries to imagine a world in which rules and norms, the WTO, does not matter as much. So all of that has longer term costs, I think this administration has not fully gamed out in a way that we will see the ripple effects in the coming weeks and months.
You talk about inflation. If all the goods coming from different countries have higher duties, eventually American consumer is going to pay high prices. So will they go on accepting this increase in prices without protesting too much? You have been in Delhi earlier, you would know in Delhi elections have been lost with the rise in price of onions.
Yeah, so just so everyone understands completely, tariffs are not directly inflationary. So what a tariff does, first of all, when you put a tariff on a good, the tariff is paid by the importer, not by the exporter. The importer can then choose to pass on higher costs to consumers. Those higher costs can likely come in the form of a one-time price rise. So by definition, a one-time price rise is a price shock, a one-time adjustment. That is not necessarily inflation, which is calculated annually, for example. But in layman's terms, over time tariffs are inflationary. They are seen as inflationary because one-time shocks can lead to other ripple effects. Um, Trump hates inflation. He criticized the Biden administration continually on high inflation during the last 4 years. And so you have to wonder again, this is where some of the short term thinking of the Trump administration clashes with the longer term ripple effects if there's inflation. The other thing is that's worth pointing out if you speak to people who have known Trump for decades, I won't name names, but I know many officials who worked very closely with him between 2016 and 2020. Trump is not ideological about many things. He's a very flexible person who believes in getting the best deal for himself. He's transactional. The one thing he is ideological about is tariffs. He actually genuinely believes that America is being hard done by the rest of the world. He genuinely believes that a trade deficit is a bad thing, so America must have surpluses. Which, by the way, is something that flies in the face of at least one part of logic, which is America's a rich country with a lot of consumers. It is more likely that America will consume and import than export because it's costly for Americans to make things and sell to the rest of the world. So pure economics would tell you that America should have a deficit rather than a surplus. But Trump hates this, and so he wants to rebalance the American trade system and therefore the global trading system. And he is willing to use whatever tools he possibly can. And here again, the rules are being tested. So there are some national security provisions that allow you to, for example, levy tariffs on steel or aluminum. You can't just levy tariffs on every single thing by saying that it's a national security issue, you know? So maybe you can stretch the definition and say face masks are a national security issue because China's making it. But are cigars trademark a national security issue? Is paper a national security issue? I don't know. And so there's a lot of testing of the limits of executive power that, again, Congress might push back on. Remember, Congress decides tariff law, not the president. So we are in strange, uncharted territory where Trump is testing the boundaries of law. He's testing the boundaries of the presidency. And again, this is the one area where he's truly ideological about. In the months to come, so far, a lot of the tariffs actually haven't gone into play. So the reciprocal tariffs, there's a 180-day wait period on it. The Canada, Mexico ones, it'll take time for all of that to ripple through the system. And once inflation starts registering, that is when we will see how much conviction Trump has in his tariff policies to see it through.
Okay, talk about tariffs. The Canada, Mexico, China are three largest trading partner of USA. Now, they do state they will also impose reciprocal tariffs, but their scope of imposing tariffs on American goods is very limited. What option do they have except accepting American tariffs after making a lot of noises? Because I don't think they have too many tools to retaliate.
Yeah, especially so China is a separate issue. I think Mexico and Canada have fewer tools to reciprocate. Again, I'll step back a little bit of context. These are two economies that have basically built their supply chains around the United States. So first there was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Then there was the rebranded USMCA. And basically with low tariffs, free trade, for example, if a car is manufactured in the United States, it goes back and forth across the Canadian border several times before you see a finished product. Each part, each component and subcomponent has, can be traced back and forth across the border many times. We don't even know how to impose tariffs on every single one of these parts. And we don't know what the ripple effects of that are going to be on the total cost of a car. That's just one example. Um, there's so many products. For example, Americans love guacamole, which is made of avocados. All the avocados come from Mexico. Were Mexico to impose tariffs on avocados, you can imagine like there's all kinds of pushback that could happen from these moves. Um, but it is very damaging to Mexico and Canada. It creates a lot of supply chain uncertainty. If you are a company that has long relied on a finished product that contains components that move back and forth a lot, you're struggling. And I think longer term, a lot of companies will start looking at different supply chains. They will look to places that offer them most certainty. A lot of businesses, even if they see some short-term benefits from some of Trump's moves, longer term, they are very worried about the stability of a system in which tariffs can be issued at the drop of a hat. There's retaliation at the drop of a hat. This does not inspire business confidence. So that is the other private sector worry on this front. Um, it takes years to reorient supply chains. I imagine the Canadians are looking at doing that, perhaps even with Europe. As I mentioned earlier, Europe is looking to reorient its defense posture. These things will take at least a decade. And of course, Trump won't be in power for that long. So a lot of things are up in the air right now.
Okay, 1 minute on Elon Musk, who arrives at meeting with his kids and one of his son on his shoulders. Now, here is a man who contributed $250 million to Trump's election fund. And he has been entrusted with enormous decision-making power, throwing the principles of conflict of interest and check and balance into wind. Is he helping the goal of MEGA, or is he dividing the American society and civil services?
Both, I guess. Maybe it is a goal of MAGA to do exactly what he is doing. Um, there are, you mentioned the $250 million. For Musk, that was nothing. He has more than made that money back on the stock market, because if you look at the valuation of Tesla, which makes no sense to a sane observer, that these high-end luxury electric vehicles, which are completely being bested by BYD in China, which makes cheaper, far superior electric vehicles at this point. So the valuation of Tesla, the only thing to explain it, Tesla is not really a company of the future at this point. The only thing to explain it is that people are betting money on Musk's closeness to Trump, not only for Tesla, but for his other ventures and companies. And when you look at it that way, Musk has absolutely gotten a return on his investment in Trump. He is worth hundreds of billions of dollars at this point. So the 250 million is nothing for him. He does have, I think, worrying control over, with DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency. He has access to data that is very worrying. If the recent reports that he has access to Social Security accounts, bank accounts, data, tax returns, that is data that can be synthesized by AI. Remember, Musk is very interested in AI right now. That worries me immensely. And I do think more Americans should be worried about the power that this one man currently has. History shows that when one person has this much power, it leads to outcomes that are not great. I shouldn't say more on this because we have lots of other topics. Uh,
Okay,
yeah.
move to foreign affairs. Now, President Trump, in his characteristic flamboyant style, wishes to end Israel-Hamas conflict by taking over Gaza, pushing more than 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza, and converting it into Mediterranean Riviera, an idea which has been rejected by major Arab countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. Now, will Trump's out-of-box plan succeed in ending the conflict or descend the region into much wider conflict?
This particular plan, I've been on the record on TV talking about it. I think it's crazy. It's lunacy. First of all, this is their home. You don't just kick people out of their home. There are 2 million people living in Gaza. They live there despite the conditions there. They want to live there. They have a sentimental attachment to that place. So it is not for an external power to decide to forcibly um, uh, transport them somewhere else and force them to uproot their lives. Second, anyone who understands Middle Eastern history knows that that very thing, a forcible movement, is something that reminds them of the Nakba in 1948, when 700,000 Palestinians were forced out. Many of them now live in the diaspora. Many of them would have loved to have been able to go back home. So this is a huge psychological wound for Gazans, for the Palestinian people, that is being reopened, that makes them very upset. But third and fourth, if you'll remember the press conference in which Trump described this plan, he kept saying that a lot of leaders in the region want this to happen. Nobody wants this to happen, other than maybe Israel, but even that we don't know for sure. But the Saudis don't want it to happen. The Egyptians don't want it to happen. The Jordanians. Where would these people go? Ostensibly, Trump would hope that they go to Egypt and Jordan. Egypt and Jordan don't want to take more Palestinians. They can't. Saudi Arabia has made very clear that were this to happen, a potential Saudi-Israel normalization deal is dead in the water. So, for a variety of reasons, this plan is a no-go. Many sound analysts see it as a distraction, and the distraction could be to allow Israel to annex the West Bank maybe in the coming weeks and months, which is something that the Trump administration has been in favor of. If you look at all the people they've put in place, Mike Huckabee, the ambassador to Israel, a lot of the US officials involved are quite keen to see Israel annex the West Bank. So there's a lot of noise and bluster on this, but I cannot imagine that the forced displacement of 2 million people from Gaza is something that could happen in 2025. I would be shocked.
Annexing West Bank, do you mean to say that the US is really indirectly helping Netanyahu to really implement what he is? He has been totally opposed to two-state solution. That means two-state solution is out of the discussion table.
I mean, many people will say that the two-state solution is a mirage at this point. If you look at how Israel has expanded its settlements year after year over the last 15 odd years, but going back even further, it's accelerated under Netanyahu. And remember, his cabinet right now is the most far right-wing cabinet in Israeli history. This is what they want to do. This is also what is quite popular in Israel. And it's not like the United States has stopped them, has issued severe sanctions to stop them from doing this. I think with Trump, Trump is just much more willing to be open about seeing it happen.
Now let's move to Ukraine. The President Trump has spoken with Russian President Putin and Ukraine President Zelensky. On 12th February, I think you might have already heard yourself, Defense Secretary delivered the bluntest message to NATO, saying Ukraine will have to forget about joining NATO and regaining pre-2014 borders. Now today, Russian and American officials are meeting in Riyadh. Maybe Putin and Trump might also meet. Now, can such a solution be thrashed out without Ukraine and NATO being involved? Even if it happens, will it last?
No. Look, whatever decision the United States and Russia try to push through, one key element of it is security. And who is going to provide security for Ukraine? Whatever territory it ends up keeping, ultimately it has to be Europeans or Ukrainians. So you cannot enforce a security guarantee without a Ukrainian and the Europeans at the table. And that's why Europe is so upset right now at being excluded from these discussions between the United States and Russia. That is why Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, called an emergency summit in Paris yesterday. Things are moving very quickly right now. So there's a lot of anger in Europe, and they are trying to mobilize to figure out how they can best secure Ukraine's future, assuming that the United States doesn't have the best interests of Ukraine in mind anymore. The UK, for example, has said it is willing to send troops to Ukraine. It would never have said that 10 days ago or 10 months ago. This is clearly a reaction to JD Vance's speech in Munich and a reaction to the news that Trump and Putin had a phone call without consulting Europe. So, can the two reach some sort of an agreement? Yeah, they can. Does it have any durability? Does it have any viability without Europeans and Ukraine at the table? No. Which is why I'm very surprised that they're taking the path that they are. Now, all of this said, I hope your viewers and callers don't see me as speaking for the Biden administration here. I mean, I've been very critical of the Biden administration as well. As a journalist, it is my job to criticize all sides, and I rarely speak for sides. So yes, the Biden administration in the early days did very well to warn the world about Russia's aggression in Ukraine, rallied support for Ukraine in the early days well. But there's a clear criticism that they then had a very incremental policy and didn't give Ukraine enough. They gave them enough to survive, not enough to win the war. So the fact that Trump is trying something different, is bringing a different energy to this situation, is not the worst thing in the world, to be clear. It was needed. But the way they are going about it, by excluding Europe and Ukraine, does not inspire confidence for the future. That worries me. It worries many observers in Europe.
Let us touch about the climate change. Now, President Trump, as he has said during his campaign, is withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement and is hailing his slogan, drill baby drill. Now, how is the US withdrawal from climate change discourse going to impact endeavors to keep the rise in temperature 1.5 centigrade, which has perhaps already been breached?
No one's thinking about climate change in the same way as they did a year ago. Trump wants to dramatically increase oil supply, energy supply. One of the big things that are animating defense and security discussions in the West right now is AI and the big race to take a clear lead in artificial intelligence compute power. And you can only do that with the highest end semiconductors. And the highest end semiconductors and chips, they take enormous amounts of power. Data centers eat up a lot of energy. And I think recognizing that and recognizing the dramatic valuations of Nvidia and all the companies that are riding the tech AI wave right now, Trump wants to dramatically expand America's energy output, whether on U.S. soil or through building um, nuclear plants in other countries, for example. There's a lot of interest in dramatically expanding energy. And when you do that, and you take that approach of drill, baby, drill, let's also lower the price of energy, because as we've discussed, Trump is allergic to inflation, then any concerns about clean energy go by the wayside. And, having pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords again, I am deeply worried about the future of clean energy. And the Trump administration is also looking at rolling back some of the provisions outlined in the Inflation Reduction Act around hydrogen and clean energy. We don't know what those are yet. So There are worrying signs on that front, but it is an example and a symptom of how newsy the last 4 weeks have been, that we aren't even able to give this element enough attention.
Well, talking about AI, as you know, Prime Minister Modi and President Macron has this conference or summit in Paris. Now, do you think the American concept of AI and what India and France were talking about are the same? Because India and France are talking about an open, inclusive, transparent, and rule-based, people-centric AI. Now, do the Americans or Elon Musk, do they have the same kind of concept? They have a different approach.
I think it's a different approach. I think the idea there is to um, be number one, to be out ahead of other countries. America really sees AI as a geopolitical competition. They're desperate to stay ahead of China. You think about all of the export controls on China in the last 3 or 4 years, all of it is about constraining China's ability to get the highest end chips and retaining American advantage. And part of this is hardware, part of it is data. So to be able to have the strongest LLMs, to have the best data sets in this race, there's a trade-off between open and inclusive and harnessing the best for yourself. And when it comes to that trade-off, I think, both the private sector and the public sector in the United States is quite clear that the trade-off leans in favor of staying ahead of China rather than a model that is truly open and truly inclusive. So, even though India and France are saying what they are, I don't think it gels with the thinking in Washington there. But one thing that Prime Minister Modi said, which I thought was very profound, when he gave that example of the left-handed, right-handed kind of data set answer, um, it shows that every country has to have its own LLMs, its own data sets that are based on its own culture and its own language and its own people, because every country has its own way of communicating, its own very specific cultural references. So I thought Prime Minister Modi was very smart in making that point in public. And it is in India's best interest also to ensure that, Indian companies and youngsters aren't just using GPT-4 or Perplexity, but there are Indian models as well with Indian data that are able to channel the Indian experience and Indian culture and Indian language, because only then will it be more useful to Indian companies.
Now, as you know, President Trump is against globalization. He also is against WTO. I mean, the US has not really agreed to appointment of so many people. The arbitration committee totally defunct. Now, if every country follows him in raising protectionist policies, what will happen to the world trade?
So I guess there are two questions here. There's World Trade and there's the World Trade Organization.
Yes.
I think the WTO is at its weakest moment in its history right now. It has been undermined by the United States, but also by many, many countries. Uh, it's very clear that rules and norms set by the WTO mean less than they have since its existence in the last several decades. World trade is a different thing. I think, you know, Trump is not against trade. He is just against trade that isn't on favorable terms to the United States and that doesn't lead to um, a trade surplus for America. So he is very hell bent on American manufacturing, American jobs, and America exporting to the world, or other companies in other countries building in the United States. And he's willing to strong arm countries and companies to make that happen. Now, the problem with doing that for too long is that countries may sense the uncertainty and the unfairness and choose to build other alliances, trade networks, relationships that bypass the United States. Now, the US is still too big and too strong um, to bypass. But if you look at the mood and the moment right now, and the number of countries that are upset with the United States and its flouting of norms and rules, it is not hard to see a time when countries band together and form their own trade agreements that exclude the United States. I mean, Europe, for example, struck a free trade deal with Mercosur, the Latin American bloc. There are now movements of countries saying, let's figure out other systems that don't involve the United States. And that should be worrying longer term for the United States. It also, again, it creates whiplash. It goes against what previous American governments have fought for and argued for, including the Trump administration, which, by the way, rebranded NAFTA to create a free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. So if you're a Canadian, you're deeply confused by this moment.
The President Trump has been saying BRICS is dead. Actually, it's 100% duty if you try de-dollarize. But fact remains that there are more than 39 countries want to join BRICS. Though we have expanded only a couple of them, Ethiopia and Iran, and we have Nigeria. But fact remains that we have a long list of countries, the developing countries, which want to join BRICS. So is President Trump underestimating the potential and the sort of scope of the influence of BRICS, or he is simply trying to bulldoze them that they don't really use other than dollar currency for their transactions?
Let me put it this way. I have not been a huge believer in BRICS in the past because it's basically, for those of you who don't know, a catchy acronym that was coined by a banker at Goldman Sachs. It sounds nice, BRICS. The S was added later, South Africa. But there is more to divide these countries than to unite them. They are all growing at different trajectories. China is the big outlier in there, the huge big economy in there. And America has long been sanctioning Russia and also China, but it is trying to grow closer to India. So there's a lot of confusion in the alliance. It's unclear what it truly stands for and what its future mission is. But the more that Trump does to jeopardize the rules-based, the norms-based order, the more other countries are likely to have reason to build their own networks of alliances. As I was saying earlier, the more the United States uses sanctions, for example, as a tool of coercion and diplomacy, the more it uses tariffs as a cudgel, the more likely it is that other countries will say, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to transact in the US dollar? And that leads to a range of other potential arrangements, whether it's in cryptocurrencies, whether it's in a block forming its own currency. I still think, the majority of global transactions are in the US dollar. And it is very, very hard to see de-dollarization truly taking off to the extent that another currency or crypto can replace it. But when you put enough pressure on the system and you give enough countries more and more and more reasons to look for alternatives, at some point you reach a tipping point of sorts. And crypto, I think, is the element here. Again, I'm not a huge believer in crypto on its own merits, but there are concerns that, if you take a stable coin and you peg it to another currency, let's say the renminbi or the Indian rupee, and you begin to transact on that for, say, trade between BRIC countries, you have the beginnings of a movement against the dollar. So that should be a huge concern. I know for a fact it is a huge concern for the United States government. But again, I think the acceleration of this trend has a lot to do with recent policy.
Let's talk about immigration. The US has been known nation of immigrants. Their contribution has been acknowledged by several past presidents. Many might have initially entered illegally, but have become an integral part of American economy, especially agriculture, infrastructure, hospitality sector, etc. How rational it is to call all of them as criminals and deport them.
I mean, first of all, you can't, right? I mean, there are millions of undocumented workers in the United States. Physically, it's impossible to deport them all. It's incredibly expensive. And then lastly, the unsaid truth is that who's going to do the work? I think when it comes to washing dishes at a restaurant or picking oranges at a, grove in California, anecdotally, the business owners, when they, advertise for these jobs, even if it's $35 an hour, which is a decent salary in the United States, they can't find workers. No one wants to do these jobs. So the presence of undocumented workers has long, historically been something that was accepted in the United States as a way for businesses to basically be able to run themselves. And for good reason, they have lobbied successive US governments to not do something about this problem. So, the Trump administration would often say, can we not agree that anything that is illegal is bad and we should do something about it? Yes. But then you also have to agree that this is a very convenient give and take that the American public, the American government, and American people have all been complicit in for decades. And so to upend it all of a sudden would be immensely disruptive. Now, this is where it's really important to distinguish between what Trump says and what he does. I think uh, knowing what we know about how incredibly expensive and difficult it is to deport millions of people, um, that the Trump administration is not going to actually do it. I think they are hoping that two things. One is in deporting a small amount of people and doing it in a very showy, flashy, cruel way, that they will stop people from coming in. They want basically to put up a big stop sign on the American border, and they want people around the world to know, don't come here. Don't come here illegally. Don't try it because we will kick you out. That is the message that they want to send. And to some degree, that message is working. The flows of attempts to enter illegally are down. And so on that front, that could be part of the strategy. But also, I think there's an element of waiting to see how the market reacts to some of these moves. I'm waiting to see which countries will be receptive to accepting these undocumented workers. Again, the question of where they go is a big unanswered question, especially in the numbers that exist. I mean, I think India, for example, is the source of something like 700,000 undocumented workers in the United States. So India has said it will take some of them, but 700,000, I highly doubt that.
As you might have read in the newspapers that the first batch of the immigrants who came from USA, India, the manner in which they brought in, it created a lot of outrage here. Now, can there be any more humane and dignified manner of sending them? Or this is
Yeah.
just
No, I think there absolutely can be. I think the cruelty is
deliberate?
designed to say, don't come here. The cruelty is designed to say, this is a new sheriff in town. We are different from the past. We are going to be tough. We are going to kick people out no matter what. It is meant to be a sharply visual symbol for the rest of the world. One other thing to understand about Trump is he understands TV and the visual medium like no one in the history of U.S. leadership. He knows the meaning of those images. He knows it's humiliating. He knows it's insulting. He knows that Indian diplomats are very upset and they have raised objections. But he also knows that if you are a worker in Punjab who wants to pay 50 lakhs to a dalal to, get to the United States illegally, that person is going to look at these images and say, nah, I probably shouldn't try this.
Okay, now, as you know, since President Clinton came in March 2000, India's relations have been expanding and deepening, irrespective which party has won the election or who is the president. Now, taking the last visit of Prime Minister Modi just last week, what do you think, Bridget? His supporters say, and I personally feel that it was a huge success. It was a very successful visit. But detractors say, no, it was not. What do you think? What is your opinion about recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to US?
So, unlike usual visits where the staff on both sides spend many, many months working on big deals, this was a hastily arranged summit. And I think the hastiness of it is part of the success because you look at who the United States invited to come. There was Israel's prime minister, the leader of Japan, and then India. So for India to be among those first three countries to get a White House visit and a press conference, that is a symbol from the Trump White House that this is a very important relationship to us. So I think that symbol is in and of itself a very good sign for anyone who likes India or wants India's best interests. I would not worry too much about what they actually discussed or what deals were struck because, this has only been a few weeks of this administration. The longer term trend line hasn't changed. I think Republicans and Democrats very openly agree that India is one of the few issues that there is, bipartisan agreement on. The relationship is strong. The longer term trajectory is strong. The two have a lot of mutual interests. Now, the interesting thing to watch here is that, again, we all know that Trump is transactional, he's opportunistic, always asking what's in it for me. In that kind of a scenario, it is interesting to read India's recent steps to reopen flights with China, to pull back from the border and calm tensions along the border with China. I think that will be read in Washington as a sign that just as America is transactional, India also is transactional and is acting in its own interests. So, just as there is America first, India also has its own interests in mind. That is not a bad thing, by the way. I think India needs to look out for its own interests. And it is one of the great successes of Indian foreign policy in the last 10, 15 years that uh, there's bipartisan agreement in Washington about the importance of the US India partnership, but B, that India has gotten successive US administrations to acknowledge and accept that India will do what is in its best interest, whether it is buying Russian oil, whether it is starting to buy more American weaponry. There's just a lot of agreement in DC that these are the choices India needs to make. So India has done a very good job of explaining these choices to the United States.
Well, talk about China. President Trump is also being very soft on China recently. Talked about 60% duty, then he imposed 10%. He says Xi Jinping is a very close friend of mine. If Xi Jinping and Trump really arrive at some kind of thought, now what happens to India's relations? Will it be adversely affected? Because a
I
lot of
don't think.
years given to India and Quad and IMEC and Indo-Pacific was largely on account of US desire to contain or at least restrain China.
Agreed. But I don't think it affects the US India relationship negatively. India's too big to not be a country that US policymakers want on their side, number one. Number two, you know, I think it is at this point hard to game out what this thaw that you're describing could look like. But also keep in mind that there remain a lot of China hawks in the Trump administration. Marco Rubio made his name in foreign policy circles as a China hawk. You look at all the people who are populating the National Security Council, many of them are China hawks. So it's hard for me to game out what a massive accommodation with China would look like. I think the best we can get is an agreement that they will manage their competition in a way that allows them to cooperate in some areas like climate and intensify the competition in areas such as semiconductors without really damaging the broader relationship. That is something the Biden administration was trying to do anyway. So I'm not seeing a huge shift at this point. But I'd also say Trump is mercurial. So tomorrow, if he decides to impose tougher sanctions or tougher tariffs, the difference is this time China is quite prepared. I mean, they have retaliatory tariffs lined up. The other thing that most people forget is that China is less exposed to the US economy than it was 10 years ago. So they have successfully reoriented some of their supply chains. They have insulated parts of their economy from the United States, which makes it harder for the US to have influence over China.
Well, we are doing fine. We're left with only 8 minutes. So let me insert two questions quickly. Now, several analysts believe that Biden administration played some role in ouster of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. Now, what do you think would be President Trump's view on Bangladesh and Pakistan?
I don't have any evidence that the Biden administration orchestrated this move. What I will say is, from a broader strategic standpoint, if you look at interests, why would it be in America's interest to do that? And I'm unconvinced with any answer I've heard that it was in U.S. interests to meddle in Bangladesh at this point. Like, to what end? What are they getting out of it? Unclear to me. Also unclear to me that the Trump administration is even thinking about Bangladesh at this point. I don't think they have gotten their full foreign policy team together. I think Bangladesh, South Asia is not a priority for the Trump administration outside of India. India is a priority. The rest of South Asia is not. The one thing that could change that is terrorism. And I'm very worried about the signs that ISIS is reconstituting in Afghanistan. Were ISIS or Al Qaeda to become a serious problem or a serious threat to the United States, and were that threat to emanate from Afghanistan or even Pakistan, that would dramatically change American thinking about South Asia. Right now, when America thinks about South Asia, they only think about Indian business and Indian cooperation. But all of you remember after 9/11, there was a moment where the entire American academic security apparatus was thinking of South Asia purely through a terrorism lens. So that is not the case right now, and that is actually a good thing for anyone who lives in South Asia.
Well, Israel, by totally almost dismantling Hezbollah in Lebanon, change of government in Syria, Hamas largely destroyed, not fully. Now, they have really damaged the capability of Iran supporting these proxies. Houthis are still firing some missiles here and there. There are a lot of talks about that Israel want to attack Iran or Iranian nuclear facilities. Do you think it can happen?
It's a very live debate in Israel right now. I think the most important thing here is capability. So, anyone with military experience on this call will know that for Israel to attack the nuclear facilities in Iran, and there are more than a dozen of them, that are deeply buried in the mountains, like 1 or 2 kilometers deep underground. To be able to attack them, you need certain types of bombs that can go very deep and blow up deep underground. Israel needs American supplies for that, number one. And number two, the planes that can carry those bombs, drop them, and then get out without being attacked. Um, those would need to be American planes. That is my understanding from speaking to US military experts. So Israel can't do this on its own. It needs American support. So the question that needs to then be asked is, would Trump go along with this? Unclear to me, because while Trump is often said to be Israel's greatest friend, Trump also doesn't want to start new wars. He's been very clear that he wants to pull America out of global wars. So those two notions are in contradiction here. But it's very much a live debate.
Lastly, a lot of people are saying whatever peace initiatives President Trump is taking, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza, Israel, this is that he is gunning for the Nobel Prize. Now, do you think President Trump will win Nobel Prize this year?
I have no idea.
Tell me, how is the Indian diaspora doing in the US today?
Really well. As all of you know, it's the highest earning demographic in the United States. I think Indian Americans are widely acknowledged to be successful, well integrated. I'm worried about recent racist remarks, for example, by someone who works for Elon Musk under Doge, when they said normalize Indian hate. Those things worry me immensely, because it does not take long to go from there to potential attacks on people. We've seen this with Asian Americans in the past. So I would not be complacent about the status and place of Indian Americans. It is very easy to go from feeling comfortable and assimilated to feeling like you are othered and attacked. Yeah, it makes me uncomfortable to talk about the success of the community, because you don't want to attract um, a reaction that is adverse. So I'll just stop there.
What is happening Democratic Party in the US after loss of Kamala Harris? They seem to be totally desolate. They have elected new leader.
They're lost right now. There are younger congressmen, congresswomen, and senators who are asking the question, what would a progressive democratic policy look like domestically and in foreign policy? And they are beginning to trial balloon some of these ideas. They're at least a year or two away from the midterms, but also from having an idea that is compelling electorally. They also need to find new leadership. I think there's a real understanding that they can't go back to the old leadership. But the bigger worry than personnel is, what is the big idea? What is the animating principle of a new Democratic Party? You can't just say we're better than the other guy. That didn't work. So you actually need an affirmative idea, a vision. And right now, they have not agreed on one.
Thank you, Ravi. You are brilliant as usual. You have covered so many things, and we have done in 1 hour. I thank all of those who have joined. Even Puneet Sapra has joined from Colorado. We have somebody from Chicago, and some people are giving company from different cities here. Thank you very much. I deeply appreciate your support to IFA. We are a very small think tank, but we have a lot of people who have served decades in foreign affairs, and they really love your comments because they are balanced and you are not biased, and you can be very frank and can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot of respect to all of you and the work that all of you have done. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Bye-bye.